Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar brought to you by Hire and sponsored by Talentful. We're really happy to have you here joining us today. Do drop us a little line in the comments. Let us know where in the world you're tuning in from. It's always lovely to see the global audiences that we get. By way of introduction, my name is Kelly McGrath-Smith. So I am the Community Director here at Hire. And if you maybe don't know about Hire, maybe this is your first time joining one of our webinars, we are a global community of HR and talent folks. So we've got over 11,000 members at the moment and growing, which is absolutely phenomenal and very exciting. We run in-person events. We had a few breakfasts that we ran this month. We actually had our London one this morning. We run virtual roundtables. So there's lots of good stuff going on inside the community. The community itself is on Slack. We've got various kind of sub-interest groups discussing, all things HR and talent. So we kind of recognize that sometimes working in this field can feel like a little bit of a lonely role at times, particularly maybe if you're a standalone in your role or you're setting up a function for the first time. So we really hope that the community allows people to connect with peers, to run questions by people, just to have someone to bounce ideas off as well. So it's a really supportive place if there's ever anything that you want to learn or run past people. What I'll do is I'll just pop a little banner below. Sorry, this has covered James's face as well. Maybe let me try. I'll do a smaller one so that we've not blocked the guest's face. So if you haven't heard of us and you want to join, if you go to hirehq.com, you'll be able to sign up. And I guess just a little bit around kind of these webinars as well. So we kind of see ourselves as almost like the hive mind of TA, and we really want to help give back to the industry. We want to help up-level folk, especially it's been a very turbulent few years in TA. So anything that we can do to kind of help people and give back. So we do these webinars every Wednesday on LinkedIn Live that are free to join. Anyone can join, and we bring you various topics from community members globally as well. So today we're talking all around engaging and retaining talent, and very key topic. This is actually our theme at our November breakfast as well. So we wanted to make sure that folks who couldn't join the in-person events also got to join in on these conversations as well. So as we go through the webinar, if you have any questions, thoughts, please do feel free to drop them in the comment box. We'll also have time for Q&A at the end, but if there's anything that you want to ask as we go, feel free to drop in a note, and we will also cover that as well. But at this point, I will hand over to our guests to introduce themselves, just so you can get to know them a little bit more before we properly dive into the topic. So Catherine, I'll go to you first if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm Catherine. I'm the Global Director TA for Ideals. We're a rapidly growing global SaaS scale-up with 400 people in just over 30 countries globally. My experience as TA leader spans 15 years in both the EMEA region and Asia, working in tech. So I've worked in Google and Microsoft, leading global high-performing TA organizations. And I'm particularly excited to contribute and learn today from a set of peers, because my view is that volatility really is the new normal. So unpredictability, variability have taught us some valuable leadership lessons in the past 4 years. And I believe also our relationship with work is transforming. Organizations and companies that want to create a really differentiated, motivated environment are going to have to think harder than ever before to achieve something special. So excited to learn today.
Amazing, great to have you. And David, I'll hand over to you next to introduce yourself.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is David Bremer. I am traditionally a head of TA, more recently a TA leadership consultant. I'm currently working with Dyson. My background is head of TA for brands like Ocado, Kingfisher, Mind Gym, different businesses. I've been in recruitment for about 23 years, which is a really long time, albeit it's still kind of enjoyable. And yeah, really looking forward to just a kind of a lively conversation and just hopefully pick up some stuff, learn some stuff, and ideally share some stuff too. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Fantastic. And then James, over to you.
Hi everyone, I'm James. I was previously at Never IMG, where I was one of the global recruitment directors across one of the kind of 60 brands that they have across sports, media, and entertainment. I got to lean on a couple of those. Prior to that, a wider background, not 23 years, but around kind of 13, 14 years now, across other advertising, communication, and entertainment brands. Really looking forward to this discussion. Loving the kind of the change, the diversity that's taking place within kind of TA and how it's constantly evolving. So loving those challenges and enjoying this discussion.
Amazing. Oh, well, great to have you all here. And I think maybe starting with Catherine, your point there around volatility being the new normal. We've kind of seen it for the last few years, right? Between what happened in TA during COVID and obviously the last year, particularly, you know, within tech landscape and all the redundancies. I guess it might be good to really look at that in terms of, you know, current challenges, trends that we're kind of noting out there in terms of, you know, that engagement piece, that retention piece that we're seeing. Catherine, I'll go to you first, just because you mentioned the topic, and then we can kind of go around. But I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I think let me start with a challenge maybe, because I feel it's never been harder to be a leader and drive engagement, like holding people accountable whilst supporting employees through disruptive sociopolitical global events. And I think particularly in our world of remote and hybrid, we're dealing with people working alone, but working together. And we're managing a sentiment of isolation as well as disconnectedness. And the workforce is experiencing a phenomenon, I think, which is labeled as the perma-crisis, which is the uncertainty caused by repetition of global disruption and sociopolitical events. And I think it requires a totally new level of deep human leadership and empathy in order to motivate and support every individual based on their unique situation and based on their needs. And I also believe really now is the time for making deliberate investments in building resilience, building engagement of TA and people teams, so that we can withstand future cycles, ups and downs. And we know the ups and downs in hiring demand and economy are for certain. So that's my view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you were saying there in terms of that kind of isolation piece, because we do have that very different way of work where you could be in a really large team, but you might be completely remote. And actually, how do we look at that engagement piece? David, do you have any kind of follow-up thoughts from Catherine's point that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's that we're in kind of relatively uncertain and unstable times, right? Especially when it comes to hiring, irrespective of the industry that you're in largely. And I think if we were to kind of relate things to the TA specifically, right, community and the TA market, over the past 3 years, we've kind of seen these huge expansions and then subsequent retractions of the market, and huge growth and huge salary inflation and huge movement. And then particularly kind of dramatic reactions from companies to kind of, you know, after the pandemic, to go through a massive kind of hiring and expansion spree. And then once again, as we hit rather hard kind of economic times, just, you know, reacting again and perpetually kind of going through this hokey cokey type motion of we're in, we're out, you know, we've got these big teams and we haven't. I think what's really important from a retention or an engagement point of view right now, personally for me, given those socioeconomic kind of factors and what the markets are doing and how that's dictating stuff, is not to kind of repeat the same mistakes perpetually. And I think that's probably what we're seeing right now, certainly in the TA market, is that, you know, we were out and then we were back in and now we're out again. And there's this massive kind of reluctance, I think, for companies to kind of overcommit and get back into the market again and, you know, make that same mistake. But also I think what we're seeing as a result of that is not only a load of kind of instability and a bunch of people kind of between things who are really valuable and really good at what they do, and for no, you know, fault of their own, they're kind of out of work. But we've also seen expansion and retraction, I think also with salaries, and with people kind of, you know, post-pandemic making moves because the bottom of the market, or, you know, different levels of the market kind of really rapidly changed, and the reward landscape and the compensation piece massively changed and shifted. And subsequently, we're in this kind of real strange position. And I'm obviously only relating it specifically right in this moment to the TA market, but I think it's really relevant of all industries and all different markets right now. You know, but it's turbulent times. I think there are a bunch of different things that companies can do to try and avoid that and to mitigate some of the risks and to make sure that people are happy and healthy and engaged. But I guess, you know, we'll come on to that over the next, you know, 45 minutes, an hour.
Yeah, absolutely. And then James, is there anything you'd like to add to those points?
No, I'd agree with both kind of what Catherine and David expanded on. I think that companies with some really kind of honest and genuine kind of leadership, where they are kind of very transparent, but kind of offer some empathy, I think is going to be kind of super important, especially to those kind of that loyalty and retention over the next couple of years. Equally, I think those companies that, as much as I think every organization, regardless of sector, have gone through a lot of challenges and changes, those who are really investing in their culture, which is a very broad question, but really investing in their culture and rewarding that loyalty and commitment, I think are going to really see those dividends in these tough times where people have gone above and beyond with limited resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of maybe just taking your point there around that like transparency piece as well. I think, you know, let's be honest, we often talk about like the role of transparency as a leader and actually the impact and effect that can have on folks that we manage. And it kind of ties into what you were saying as well, Catherine, around that kind of deep human leadership and leading with empathy. Maybe we can talk a little bit more around that in terms of, you know, when we are going through turbulent times, like how can you effectively communicate with teams in a way that doesn't make them feel isolated or doesn't make them feel like they're an afterthought? So actually, you know, while times are tough, we're still fostering an engagement and we're still looking after people. Catherine, I'll go to you to start with this one, if that's all right.
Yeah, thank you. I think being really intentional how you communicate, particularly during times of like ambiguity, nonstop change, really, really matters. And I think also transparent communication does build trust, which is a foundation for retaining talent as well. What's particularly important in period of high stress or high change, that you're really visible and accessible. I think people really need to see, hear, and experience their management team during these times. What I've experienced as well, like what works is like really addressing the uncomfortable topics with clarity as well as with care, acknowledging the uncertainty, providing information that will help the team understanding what's happening right now and also what might be coming in the near future. So, for example, addressing workforce reductions, which many of us had to go through in the last year, sharing the context, sharing the business priorities, and really opening a door for dialogue. And it's going to be an uncomfortable dialogue, but also being able to articulate what you don't know. And I think constant communication, transparent communication, using several communication channels as well in several ways to land the message is particularly important. Whilst you also need to give people opportunities to share concerns, ask questions, offer their ideas. And I think we really needed to make it a priority as well, to follow up with answers and to follow up with updates. Because I think people need the regular contact, the expression of concern, really in order to be heard. Yeah, that's to me an important factor when it comes around transparency and communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, would you have any follow-up thoughts around that kind of transparency and best ways to communicate?
Yeah, I really do. I think a lot of companies really get this wrong, right? And the reason that they get it wrong is that they either fail to communicate or they fail to communicate at the right level and make the messaging kind of resonate with people where they are. So if you think about the kind of the fundamental principles of writing a job spec, right, or a job copy, piece of job copy and advert, you start in the macro and you work down to the micro, right? You talk about the company at the highest level and what the company's goals are and what it's trying to achieve, why it's in the market. You then talk about some of the goals maybe and how that department or whatever it is relevant to that overall goal. And then you talk about the position itself, right? This is kind of similar to that for me personally. So what you don't want to do in times of uncertainty is have one of those kind of really super scripted, very carefully worded, CEO kind of statements that go, good news, it's going to be okay, we'll weather the storm. Actually, what you kind of need is a little bit more detail than that kind of says, do you know what? Here are some of the market factors or the industry factors or global factors that are affecting things. Here's why we're taking the stance that we're taking. And then you can kind of make it relevant by delivering that to each of the different departmental leaders. They can then kind of trickle that down in a more, here's why that's relevant to you, to the individual level, right? And kind of say, well, in TA, our job during this period where we're slowing down hiring is to X, Y, Z. And here's how we can help the overall picture by doing, A, B, C. I think this is kind of where people fail from a leadership perspective. Don't get me wrong. I think that there is a degree of reality that you don't always want to share. If you're in profit warnings and the chances are that in a couple of weeks' time, you're going to be making some hard decisions and whatever, then of course, you have to be kind of diplomatic and pragmatic about it. But actually, it's about genuine, authentic kind of messages that come from the top that actually then seep down in a meaningful way, right? It's like a waterfall effect. And what typically happens is you get this big message up at the top. You then get something here from the leader that you have or the line manager that you have. The two don't necessarily talk to each other. They're not necessarily congruent messages. And you kind of get this confusion then. And so, yeah, for me, it's all about taking it from the macro and putting it into the micro and helping people to understand how it affects them and what they can do. It's not just about saying, well, there it is, that's how it's going. You then kind of say, well, okay, so what now? What's the action? What's the consequence? What are we going to do to try and mitigate it and bring it to life for people? And that for me is what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it really is that trickle down effect, because usually you do get the message first and foremost from the CEO, but then it's like, how do you translate that? How does that affect each person doing their role? And, again, coming back to that piece around, that human approach, because every person who's going through it will have their whole own history and baggage and personal life that will mean it'll affect them in a way that maybe leaders aren't even privy to. James, is there anything that you'd add or you'd like to kind of chip in terms of that kind of transparency and effective communication element?
Yeah, I think I think it's integral. It's so important. But I think one of the most highest profile examples of that was actually during COVID, like Airbnb and Brian Chesky and how they approached the fact that they laid off 25% of their workforce. But you saw a lot of, as David mentioned, you saw a lot of companies get it wrong in the way that they kind of approach it. But through Brian and that leadership team's kind of approach, transparency, empathy, it was almost a positive thing at the end. I mean, the amount of people that rallied around to try and support getting these people kind of new opportunities, even Brian kind of networking his own kind of network and things like that. It was quite inspiring kind of to see, and you could see it was really personal to him. Like you saw the empathy, like it really hit him. It wasn't just about the P&L. This was personal. I think kind of specifically kind of related to kind of TA, it can be scary for a lot of teams when you're going through a lot of uncertainty and there's a lack of hiring, and the instant kind of thought is, well, are we going to have jobs? But what I would do is kind of try and challenge that behavior, be honest around what's kind of going on, but challenge that behavior around, okay, well, have we got an opportunity here? Because generally in disruption and things like that, it can present opportunities. And okay, we haven't got the kind of the BAU kind of, we're recruiting 50 roles at a time and blah, blah, blah. Like, have we got the opportunity now to focus on those projects to develop that maturity of kind of that TA kind of brand internally and add value in other areas? Like, there's the standard stuff like pipelining and blah, blah, blah. But, what can we be doing from an employment brand perspective? Like, how can we help other people out there? What can we do from a kind of an impact perspective? Like, there are, or from a innovation perspective, I think there's tons of ways you can start kind of adding value if you look at it, doing a lot of what was kind of a nice to kind of have when we were really busy, to kind of what becomes like a must-have kind of focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like that almost like agile approach is like TA can do so much more than just hiring. Like you said, there's projects, but there's also a lot of folks I've spoken to who, and granted, not every company has been able to do this, but you can almost, lend TA out to another team because they're very transferable skills. You could have a TA working within project management or within sales, and kind of looking at it in a little bit more of kind of a creative and innovative way. I guess when it comes to, maybe strategies or anything that you've experienced before in terms of engagement retention strategies that have worked, maybe it is anything from kind of moving people to different teams. Is there anything that you've seen that's worked really well, or it could even be something that you've seen that sounded great on paper but actually didn't work so well in reality? Catherine, how about you in terms of those strategies that maybe you've seen in terms of mitigating those risks?
Yeah, what I've seen some companies do really well is repurposing talent and actually being really agile, proactive around shifting TA and people resources where they're most needed. I think that's one thing. The other experience I have, which is a very interesting strategy to foster engagement and innovation, is around infusing design thinking methods to really engage people to co-create. So driving retention by making everyone in the team a change agent and equipping people with context and tools and leadership support for them to develop new ideas, how TA, for example, can serve stakeholders and create shareholder value in new ways. And we're at that inflection point right now where we really need to rethink how TA is going to add value in the future. So I'm actually currently in my role going with my team through a design sprint that really creates energy and involves the team in designing change processes, tackling real problems, and we capitalize on the collaborative nature as well of the ideation sessions. So I think design sprints really you can use to shape a new operating model, solve problems. And what works well here as well, you can push both the ideation, the contribution levels of the team, and then also the ownership when it comes down to implementing a process or landing a change.
Amazing. That's really interesting. We actually had a webinar a few months back around kind of using design thinking when it came to revamping the candidate experience. So actually it's really interesting to see the different ways that you can kind of use that approach, even with employee engagement and retention. David, how about you in terms of strategies that maybe you've seen or implemented?
So I actually started a role on pretty much the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. And I actually started a job at the pub company as their head of recruitment. And my first meeting on my first day literally was, Boris is closing the pubs. And so I have had some kind of first-hand experience of this. And what I saw that particular company do was to be super resilient in completely unprecedented circumstances and just kind of say, right, well, we know that hiring is completely out of the window. However, our hiring team are all over the UK, our HR business partners are over the UK, everyone's everywhere, the different kind of landlords and nightclubs and whatever that the business owned needed help. And whether that was, just cleaning down premises, locking it up, boarding things up, or whether it was destroying beer, people just kind of rallied around. But I think the great thing about that was actually more that they had such a strong community anyway, and they had such a strong culture, and so many people had such really long tenure with the business, and most of them had come from the bars or the clubs or the whatever, that they automatically just went straight to we're a team, we do whatever work we need to do, right? And in a kind of a couple of week period, I saw people who were recruiters or L&D professionals or whatever on a kind of a daily basis, going out and literally destroying barrels of beer and closing up, pubs and emptying fridges and disinfecting. Yeah. And no one was kind of too big for their boots about it. And I think the reason for that was that was kind of all the way from the top down, right? So you kind of saw all the different directors of the business doing exactly the same thing, literally getting in their cars, driving out, taking, the kind of the masks and the PPC. Is it PPC? Was that what it was? I don't know. There was an acronym for it anyway. Yeah. All of the protective equipment, they were kind of taking it all out. And there was just a real kind of togetherness in that business. And I feel like they kind of handled it incredibly well as an industry that was so profoundly hit and impacted really negatively by that. The business could have just kind of said, right, well, if there's no money coming in, we're not paying any money out, everybody on furlough, go. But they did the right thing by people. And, I think it all starts at the top, and they had exceptional leadership and they led by example, I guess.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it really does come back to, like you said, that trickle down effect, no one being too big or important to do what's needed, especially in times like that where it's so, and I hate to use the word unprecedented because I feel like we've heard that so many times, but no one had that experience before, and it really does kind of make people feel like they're coming together as a team. And then James, how about you in terms of that piece around, maybe a strategy you've implemented or you've seen that's worked or not worked in organizations?
So yeah, I'd kind of elaborate on Catherine's point. I think like a strong internal mobility kind of program is really essential within those times, because at the time I was working for one of the large kind of communication agencies, and we were lucky. We had quite a diverse business where you had some areas focused around consumer, other kind of practices around kind of healthcare. So as you can imagine, our consumer practice was hit quite hard, but other areas like healthcare, kind of the growth shot through the roof. But the fact that kind of both our peers in kind of HR as well as the recruiters are so embedded within the teams, we could identify great talent and move them around to kind of mitigate things like furlough or any kind of redundancies. What this also did was injected a bit of diversity of thought in some of those kind of sectors that traditionally would only hire from, say, healthcare backgrounds and things like that. So I think that's really important. And then as I say, from a TA lens, it's trying to demonstrate that value that you bring. It's demonstrating that you're not just around putting bums on seats, but using this time as a luxury to kind of focus on developing that employer brand, or what those kind of key projects are. DEI, kind of embedding yourself within ERGs, or upskilling yourself through various kind of different kind of L&D areas. What you could be doing from an L&D perspective to the business, like how can we kind of create better employee advocacy or thought leadership or interview training programs. There's tons that you could do. So I kind of quite enjoyed the challenge within those times. Wasn't always easy, but I think that when you're pushed, that you can bring those people together, and you definitely see the best out of people, and actually brought us, not only as a TA team, but as a company, much closer, I think.
Amazing. And I think actually it kind of brings us quite nicely kind of onto the next, I guess, area to talk around, which is more around that kind of workplace culture and creating an environment that people, want to be part of and want to stay. And I think what's interesting about culture is really what we mean is belonging most of the time. People want to feel like, they belong, whether they're remote, whether they're hybrid. Culture is not, going down for a pint in the pub, right? It's like something so much bigger, and it's something that people, sometimes it's a little bit untangible. They're just like, I want to be part of this team. Like you said, David, it's someone who their role could be whatever, and they're out there, breaking down barrels of beer. What is it that leaders can kind of do when it comes to helping to foster, that piece around culture, that piece around belonging within teams? David, I'll shake things up and go to you first for this one.
Okay. So I think when it comes to kind of building an engaging team, a lot of it depends somewhat on circumstance, right? So if you're a new leader into a business and you've got kind of a huge kind of merger and acquisition, or you're bringing different teams together or whatever it is, which I've done a bunch of times, it can be incredibly hard to kind of build or encourage the right type of culture and communication and openness and belonging, because you often have different groups of people who are coming at things at the same thing from a different angle. For me personally, the way that I kind of like to go about things is to kind of really foster a culture where you kind of give autonomy and you give trust, right? I think as a leader, you always have a couple of options. People can either have your respect and your trust from day one, or you can make them earn it, right? I'm not a fan of the latter. I'm more of a kind of a give people the respect, give them the trust, give them the autonomy, and also encourage people to fail. Because if you're failing, then you're trying new things, right? And also if you're trying new things, it means that you're being challenged. And if you're challenged, chances are you're probably a bit more engaged in your work. So I think it all comes from a few values or behaviors from the leader. And I think that's where it starts. And it's not just about compensation and, you know, I'm going to get you all paid more and we're going to make you a huge, you know, oh, it doesn't matter, you know, come in at 10:30 and leave at 3, you know, that kind of surface kind of stuff very, very quickly kind of subsides, and people aren't really that interested after a while. What people really want, in my albeit quite humble opinion, is they want to belong. They want to feel like they're contributing towards something. They want to feel valued, and they want to feel at home. You know, I saw a great post the other day, and it was talking about how businesses aren't families. People often talk about, you know, we've got this real family culture. Like, no, you don't. It's not a family, it's a business, right? If you left by next week, you'd probably be replaced. But what you are actually is a high performing, high functioning team. And if you kind of engage on that level, rather than that kind of almost pseudo David Brent type style of leadership, where it's just like, oh, hey, everybody, you know, we're all pals and let's go for beers. That kind of subsides very, very quickly if the substance and the belief and the values and stuff aren't behind it. But yeah, I think for me, it always comes down to trust, respect, autonomy, and allowing people to kind of make mistakes and encouraging that. Because if you do those things, I think the rest of it follows. If you just try and do the surface stuff of, you know, we do beers every Thursday, right? No one cares. They don't, you know. But that's I guess that's my view, and that's typically my approach. Albeit the last few kind of teams and stuff I've kind of inherited from other people. I've had to do massive kind of transformational work with, and if you're doing the transformational work, chances of trying to, you know, foster an inclusive and engaging culture is pretty slim.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I think that piece around it being a business, not a family. Certainly, in recent years, I think people have recognised that as, you know, let's call it what it is. You know, you work here. It's unless it's a family business and you happen.
Well, exactly right. If you've got a family business and you're like a funeral home, or, you know, a funeral parlor or something like that, yeah, that quite literally is a family. If you're a bunch of strangers that have worked together for like 3 months, no.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes, you know, there's a lot of problems that come with that, because actually people feel they can owe a company kind of too much to that point of burnout, or, you know, it just does not necessarily give you the best results. James, how about you in terms of that piece around workplace culture, belonging, and how we can really kind of foster that as leaders?
Do you know what? I think, like, David hit the nail on the head there. I think that was a fantastic answer. I think also leading back to kind of what Catherine was saying, you know, being a leader that's present, leading by example, thought leader in the industry that can inspire and is being seen to innovate, being very genuine, and being very passionate with a clear strategy for success. I think, between those two things, not much to ask, but between those things, I think, you're doing something right.
Yeah, absolutely. And Catherine, would you add anything to this? I know you've kind of spoke about it kind of in other answers, but is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, I'm feeling super inspired what James and David already mentioned. I would also really underscore values-driven culture and values-driven leadership, especially in a remote first or hybrid world. We know people leave companies because of bosses, not always because of the organizations themselves. So driving that followership as a leader is really crucial to creating a culture in an environment where people want to be. And it really starts with onboarding, actually getting the onboarding right in remote environments, letting new starters see the culture and values through personalized interactions, through creating meaning and purpose, through direct messages that come from senior leaders. So really being intentional about how you connect with individuals, with peers, with buddies, building connections from the start, and investing in social cohesion also matters and ties back to what we already heard. And I think the newer generation as well entering the workforce really values flexibility and autonomy. I think those are two areas that we'll need to look into a bit more in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you covered such a good point there around that onboarding piece, because when it comes to certainly engagement and both retention, we know the impact, the first 3 to 6 months has on someone within a business. And, a bad onboarding experience, you can have someone leave within their probation, and, the repercussions can be, quite grand on a company-wide scale. I guess on that point on onboarding, is there anything that anyone would like to add in terms of, maybe the benefits of onboarding, or anything that you've seen work really well when it comes to that, engagement and capturing it from that really early point?
I would encourage, I guess for anyone who's listening, I would encourage them to kind of think about onboarding in a slightly different way. Onboarding kind of represents anything really from the point at which a candidate applies, pretty much all the way through, their first year of employment, right? You have pre-boarding, which is the bit before they join the business, when you're kind of trying to get them on board and you're trying to get them through that hiring stage. You've got onboarding, which is the point at which they're joining, but then you've got post-boarding, which I've yet to come up with a sexier word for it, but it's that kind of period really where you think your job is done just because someone gets through their probation period or whatever it is at 3 months. Your onboarding isn't done at that point. Those people can still disembark at any point that they see fit, and they will. People will vote with their feet. I think good onboarding starts with a really good job description where you don't tell any lies and you tell the truth about what it is to come to, do this job in this company at this time. Because often what people are sold is a bit of a dream rather than the reality. And I think that's the first pitfall in onboarding. And it's at the very, very first juncture where someone sees a job ad and looks at the job spec. But I think one of the bigger other kind of faux pas is actually at the back end of the process too. So when people are exiting a business, it's a hugely missed opportunity. 9 out of 10 companies don't have a defined, consistent exit process. So at the point where you're losing people, in every company I've worked in for the last 3 different companies, I've implemented kind of boomerang hiring kind of strategies, and we've rehired 20% in each of those companies, 20% of the people that have left, because in doing so and in doing a consistent exit interview, you learn more about why they left in the first place. So it's not just about the onboarding experience, it's also about the offboarding and trying to understand why people are going. But moreover, if people do decide to leave, why do you want to bring them back? And could you bring them back? And would they come back if the grass wasn't greener? Because it so often isn't. you know, you get sold a dream, or you move for the extra 5 or 10 or 20 grand, and you think it's going to be great, and it's not. And actually, you may have just been leaving because you didn't quite find the right balance, and you asked for it and you couldn't get it because you had a poor leader, right? But I think onboarding doesn't really ever stop until you've been in a business for like a year, maybe 2 years. As far as I'm concerned, you're still in a kind of an onboarding phase. That company has to keep its promise. And I guess that's my view on it.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point around the exit interviews, and also making sure that TA is also involved from a, you know, knowledge sharing perspective, because I think sometimes it can sit more with HR, and actually if the recruiter is then rehiring that role, there might be something where you don't want history to make the same mistakes. There might just be a flaw with the role specifically, or the department, that actually you need a little bit of a rejig. So I think we've all seen cases where you probably hire the same role 2 or 3 times and you're like, something's not quite adding up here, and it's not on the recruiter. What I'll do after the webinar as well is I will link to a previous webinar that we did all around onboarding, and we also covered re-onboarding, and this is looking at folks who are coming back. They haven't left the business, but they've either been away for like parental leave or carers leave, and actually the importance of like giving them a reintegration program as well from that kind of engagement and retention perspective, because, you know, and we talk about it on that webinar, but there's a lot of stats around, you know, returning parents, for example, not having the right support environment when they do come back to work, and then you can lose a great hire. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to be done with onboarding, and like you said, if it never ends until someone leaves the business, you're kind of, you know, constantly onboarding or moving them around if you've got internal mobility. And I guess, you know, before we kind of wrap up, one of the things that would be kind of good to cover is almost that kind of measuring and monitoring piece around, you know, employee engagement and retention. And maybe we can talk a little bit around, you know, employee surveys, if you've done them before, what you have felt worked or didn't work about them. I know a lot of companies do these differently. There's different tools. But Catherine, maybe to yourself in terms of what you've experienced from, you know, a monitoring and measuring perspective, and if you've used engagement surveys or tools.
Yeah, very happy to. I think all of us have experienced different tools and surveys throughout our careers. But maybe before we just jump straight into examples of measurement and categories and data, I also would probably ask the question to the group: can we truly assess the level of satisfaction, commitment, motivation with help of surveys alone and retention data? I think there's a couple of additional areas we need to pay attention to as well when it comes to measuring experience, which is really having an ongoing dialogue with our organization, like getting a pulse of people, especially in remote environments, having trusted one-to-ones and surveys, like pulse surveys that are outside of the traditional cycle. And I think it's important to regularly speak to people as well, like what they really need for better performance and motivation, not just have that one checkpoint in the year. Speak to understand what is the lived experience of our teams, and really tapping into their ideas and insights for innovation. And then also follow up regularly, tell people like about the changes that you've made, the changes that are going to be implemented based on the feedback they've shared, either in a survey or based in a one-on-one. That very often can lead to engagement and excitement, much more than some of the experience surveys. Because what I've seen some companies do incredibly well have a 60-page experience survey with a lot of data points, but then what are you going to do with the data is what really matters most. And I think it's about being able to understand where are the outliers, and then being able to break down truly what matters to individuals. One hand is, yes, we have the data, but on the other hand, what will truly be like the 1 or 2 topics to tackle for an organization or sub-team or a market that will move the needle on engagement. And I think it takes so much more dialogue, workshops, and focus group to get to the core of what a team truly needs, or what will matter to individuals. So I think that's my 2 cents in terms of like the data we typically look at in engagement, or the data which I personally think is super relevant, is around productivity, well-being, professional development, so learning and development sentiment, as well as leadership, what people think about leadership. Yeah, but I'd love to hear as well from James and David. What are the areas that that you tap into, and what are the metrics that truly matter?
You want to go first, James?
Sure. Look, Catherine, I think what you mentioned about the surveys was a really good point. I think like the large surveys can sometimes not really give you kind of the data kind of that you're looking for either, just because the engagement levels generally can be quite low. But I've found from personal experience that more kind of like micro surveys can be much stronger. So like you mentioned, working with smaller populations. So it could be, let's say, for example, why don't we look at all the hires we made in 2022, engage with those guys to get an understanding of what their experience was, as David mentioned, kind of that pre-onboarding, onboarding piece, and how we can improve things. So, and because we've got personal touch points to the people, because we've hired pretty much every single one of them, I have found that you've got a much stronger engaged kind of community, and one, like you say, that you can then have follow-up kind of focus sessions to really kind of ascertain what the biggest problems are and how to address those. Following on from other kind of point you made, I think that if you're going to do a big engagement survey or any sort of engagement survey, I think you need to have clear and defined goals. Like, what do you really want to get out of this? Are you doing a survey just because it's an annual thing and you're ticking a box? Like, because if you are, it's the wrong reasons. And I think you need to be conscious as well of what's going on in the wider company, because I've seen instances where survey goes out after survey and engagement levels just drop off a cliff, and there's just no point in doing it. So you need to really tailor your approach and be connected with your peers across kind of wider HR teams or the wider business, just to kind of make sure that if you are doing it, you're doing it for the right reasons and you're doing it to the right audience. In terms of those metrics, I'd agree with you. I think like there's a number of different metrics you can look at. The satisfaction scores, retention rates. You can look at productivity levels, absenteeism, do a net promoter score, looking at employer diversity inclusion metrics, as well as kind of the kind of L&D opportunities. So I think there's tons to go at, but I think you've really got to tailor it to kind of the needs or the part of the business that you're focused on. David, what are your thoughts?
So I think for me, it's not what you do, it's why you're doing it. So, you know, if you're in an organization and you're lucky enough to be able to afford a platform like a Peakon or a Glint or, you know, one of these wonderful tools that will ask 25 questions every 30 or 60 or 90 or whatever days, I think that's fantastic. But what I have experienced in a number of companies, like you just said, James, is it's kind of more of a tick box exercise. And it's kind of like, well, we want you to feel like you're being valued, so we're going to ask you for your opinion. But actually, I've very seldom actually seen any substance from a lot of companies. And actually, here's what we heard, and here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to take some action with that type of stuff. I think that from a metric point of view, you know, you make a really relevant point about kind of diversity and different things and what have you. I think that the reality is there's only really one that kind of, for me, is about whether people feel valued and feel part of something bigger than themselves. Because I think that is where purpose comes from. And without purpose, I think largely people have jobs rather than careers. So, you know, it's massively about that for me. You know, don't get me wrong, it's lovely if you're at a company and you kind of get the highest leadership engagement score, you know, you can lord it over people for 5 minutes in your peer group and just have a bit of a laugh with it. But ultimately, it's about whether people, you know, feel that sense of purpose for me. And honestly think it's about why you're doing it, and often, or too often, it's a tick box exercise, and there's no consequence, and there's no output, there's no commitment to change. So yeah, I'm a big fan of it if it's conducted in the right way. I once worked for a company that did it literally every 30 days, and you're just a bit like, really? Like, honestly, I haven't even read 2 newspapers in that time, and yet I'm going to change my opinion on how I'm employed, right? Yeah, I'm not a massive skeptic on this stuff. I'm a big fan of it, but I think it's always about, I think companies lose sight of that typically. They focus on the what and hitting the right metrics and asking the right questions, tick, and then they kind of move on. And I think that's a massive fail, honestly.
Yeah, some really interesting points. And I think, like you said, it's the why, but it's also what's done afterwards. I think that's where sometimes people get survey fatigue. Like you said, David, if you're getting them every 30 days, but actually you're not seeing changes implemented, or it's not being communicated in terms of, we recognize that X, Y, and Z is a problem. These are the plans we're putting in place. You then get, like James, you're saying, like disengagement. People just go, why am I filling this out? Nothing's changing. And I think if you do it less often, but actually you are listening to people, and you're having maybe those smaller groups where you're explaining, right, this is the strategy in terms of the roadmap, in terms of how we're going to change things, it actually makes people feel like, wow, my voice is being heard. I say something and change can happen. I think that can be powerful, but if it doesn't happen, you tend to find people become a little bit disengaged and disheartened with it. We're coming up to the end, which is, one of those things. I feel like every time I'm on these conversations, I feel like we could actually go on for hours, and we could, but we won't, because I know an hour is enough time out of everyone's days, and for those tuning in. If anyone listening has any questions or thoughts that you want to share now with the panel while we are live, please do drop it in the comment box, and we'll do our best to kind of get to everyone if there are any questions. I think maybe the final point to maybe just end on from our side is maybe, David, to your point around that purpose piece. Is there anything that leaders can do, especially in times like this, where maybe people are feeling maybe a little bit lost with their purpose? Like, how can we start to engage people in terms of meaning and purpose in their roles? Are there any kind of tips or tactics that you might recommend?
I think the one thing that I find that people really respond to universally well is humility. I don't think that anyone expects, complete direction and, confirmation and reassurance from every leader ever, right? And you kind of don't, I guess it's about the humility of being able to kind of go to your team and say, do you know what? I don't really know everything, and I don't have all of the answers, but here is what I do know. And I think that's enough to give us the reassurance that we need. Or, I'd love to get your view on this. Engaging a team in a really meaningful way means asking them their opinion and their view and for their input. Just because someone is at a coordinator level, or someone is, not at the, in the leadership space, it doesn't mean that they don't have valued or valid opinions. And I think, some of the best leadership I've ever experienced as an employee, or as a, as a line report, has been where those people have said, I don't have all the answers, but we're in it together, and I want to hear your ideas, and let's do this and let's do that, and we'll be a team about it. So I think if I was to sum it up in one word, it's humility for me.
Amazing.
Short one.
Anyone else want to add anything before we wrap up?
Yeah, maybe I build on to what David just said. I think it's also about staying relevant, really, like involving the team in a cognitive exercise around how we as TA can continue to stay relevant and deliver stakeholder value in new ways. And this is really rethinking how we shape the future of the workforce, how we contribute yeah, how we support the rapid shift in talent needs, how we are actually in the driving seat, adopting AI proactively and generating value. And I think that's a really interesting exercise to do at this point in time.
Fantastic. And any final words of wisdom from you, James?
Well, I think Catherine and David summed things up really well. But alongside that purpose, I think it's unifying the team, making them feel connected, whether you're in person or virtually. I mean, there's ways that you can regularly kind of have those one-to-ones to check in with individuals and support them and coach them, or widely kind of create those platforms as teams to kind of come together to kind of, from an ideation perspective, or brainstorm and collectively try and find an answer that, as David mentioned, you might not have the answer to yourself. That's why we have all these people. I don't think any one individual has all the answers. And if we talk about diversity as a whole, and the importance of it, it's diversity of thought, it's diversity of life experiences, and that's why you see high performing teams, or diverse teams are the most high performing, is because you have that diversity of thought and life experiences. And I think that's where you get the most creativity and real ideation and innovation comes from.
Amazing. Well, what a brilliant conversation it's been. Thank you all so much for joining us, and to our guests for giving up time out of their Wednesday. So I had to check. I was like, what day is it? It's Wednesday. It's been really brilliant to chat to you all, and hopefully we'll get to kind of continue this conversation over in Hire as well. Again, I've popped a little banner below, which I always think looks like something from the news with the little sliding banner. But if you're not a member of our community, you can head to hirehq.com. It's anyone who works in internal TA, internal HR, do come and join us. We have these webinars every Wednesday, and then we have in-person and other virtual events as well. So there's lots of good stuff, no matter whether you prefer in-person or virtual, or just want a chin wag over Slack. But thank you all for joining. We will see you next week for our next webinar, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday evenings, everyone. Thank you so much. See you later.
Thank you.